Hello, welcome, please come in. Our Scholar, Chemist, Alchemist, Machinist runs have been completed, and we arrive at the summary video. Boy, that's a mouthful. I really need to figure out what I'm actually going to call this series, because Final Fantasy really cannot decide what they are going to call their Good at Items class. Oh well, that is a later problem. Now we need to go through the runs and talk about what went well, what went poorly, and how these runs compare to one another. And I think one of the really interesting things is the mechanical through lines for each of the classes. And of course the mechanics that were not consistent. Every class on this list was better at using consumables, but how comprehensive that bonus was varied a lot. Scholars and Chemists are good at everything, though Final Fantasy V doesn't actually have offensive consumables. FF10-2 requires you to learn individual abilities, and Machinist is stuck only boosting healing items. And then there are the less consistent abilities. Scholars get Scan for free in FF3, though how useful that actually is questionable. Then FF5 gets the unique Drink command, which would almost be good enough for a class by itself, but both 10-2 and 5 get Mix, which function so differently in practice from one another that they might as well be different commands. And of course 12, which doesn't really have anything unique to it. I mean, equipping measures, does that count? As usual, that's entirely because the license grids of 12 were tacked on after the initial release, so how distinct each class works out to be varies. But enough preamble, let's start the comparison. Which means it's time for Tier Maker and the difficulty comparison, and it starts in the first game I played, FF3. And FF3 gets to be placed in the top slot. This is definitely the hardest of the 4 runs, though don't read too much into that, it was still considerably easier than prior Final Fantasy III runs. Which is pretty surprising by itself. I went into this run really expecting this to be a nightmare. Prior attempts through the game with Red Mage and White Mage Devout were pretty fine runs until they turned miserable right at the end. And considering the nicheness of Scholar, I expected it to be even worse. And it just wasn't. Scholars do suffer in the early section for lack of weapon access, only having 2 copies of each elemental book, at least until the Invincible unlocks. And they continue to suffer throughout the entire game because of the rarity of offensive consumables. You get a decent number in chests, and some enemies do drop them, but those drop rates are really bad. The steal rates are a lot better, but that does not help me when everybody is locked as Scholars. This meant a lot of the game was just swing books while throwing out random potions for healing. On the other hand, my healing was really strong for most of the game. 1000 HP eventually becomes 1500 HP per high potion, and that's enough single target healing for almost the entire game. And while I spent most of the game doing everything I could to conserve my offensive items, when I did let loose, it was real good. A combination of 2 to 3 times damage with a very high intelligence means my damage with items was quite impressive. In the final sequence of fights, I even managed to hit the damage cap, albeit with the incredibly rare Chocobo's Wrath, meaning a properly leveled Scholar has damage output rivaling Ninja, which is bonkers. All these factors combined meant most of the game was tricky and difficult, but not super challenging. FF3 still manages to take the top slot in difficulty because of the final boss rush, though. 6 endgame bosses in a row with limited offensive items and no opportunity to restock on healing items is really tough. The entire final section was a careful balance of when to use items and when to save them. And my first real attempt was real close and really challenging, and I just wasn't quite good enough. Which was a real bummer. But it should be noted that I actually was a lot less mad after this playthrough of FF3 than I normally am. Scholars may not be the ideal class to stand alone, but having both offensive and healing items means their damage outperforms prior runs in both healing and damage, which is genuinely surprising. So while it was considerably less challenging than prior FF3 runs, it is still the hardest of these item specialist runs. And next up is FF5, which gets to earn the second slot. And that mostly comes down to the early game challenge. Chemists in 5 really have no damage output with their low stats and disappointing equipment access. I mean, it's not like it's White Mage bad, but daggers are pretty meh throughout the entire game. And that really shows early on. Mix can be unlocked fairly early and is incredibly strong, but a lot of the most valuable mix materials aren't available early on. Healing really suffers, with potions only healing 100 HP after being doubled by the pharmacology bonus. And while you can mix potions to slightly boost their efficacy, the bonus is bad. Better, but still bad. So, the early portions of this run, your options are limited, your attacks are weak, and the early portions are really challenging. And if that challenge persisted, 5 would likely have earned the top slot. But it doesn't. It starts to erode slowly as additional options come online. Once you can purchase ethers, you can now easily mix X potions, meaning healing is no longer a concern. Then you reach World 2 and you can buy holy water and the various beverages. And once these powerful options show up, the difficulty starts to fall apart. Don't get me wrong, it's never mindlessly easy. The complicated spreadsheet of mix results sees to that, but the drink command by itself is incredibly strong. Double HP? Yes please. Increased attack? You shouldn't have. Haste? Just what I've always wanted. And then you start to get into the powerful mixtures. The resist element mixtures let you absorb certain elements, which is only situationally useful, but when it's useful, it's very useful. Levisalve, Life Water, and Life Shield are all fairly useful little bonuses. Remedies are one of the few ways to reliably cure a target of old. And because one of the drink beverages increases your level, old is no longer the death sentence it often is. Succubus Kiss dealing big damage and draining is a great 2-for-1 benefit, and who doesn't love a turtle soup for a defense drop on a target? And of course, we can't forget the Blessed Kiss. Berserk, Haste, and Blink, all at the cost of easily acquirable consumable items. This was my main offensive tool from the moment I could buy holy water through the end of the game. And while many bosses in this game have mechanics to try to stop me, none actually managed it. And the entire second half of FF5 was mostly just a fun romp. Mix is just so strong. The only real limit on my mixes was the Dragon Fang, Turtle Shell, and Dark Matter. These are useful mix components, but unlike the other items, can't be purchased. They need to be grinded from enemies, which is a bummer. But even having to be mindful of how many Turtle Shells and Dragon Fangs I use, lest I have to spend another few hours grinding them, it didn't really slow me down. So the game spent the first third being difficult and tricky, and then it was a pretty easy experience. So that's going to average out to second place. And next on the comparison is 10-2, a new entry in the class comparison, and it falls into last place. This was the easiest run in the series, and frankly it wasn't even close. It did look like it might be challenging, very briefly. Alchemist's basic attacks are very weak, particularly early on, and while they do get bonuses to item damages, these bonuses need to be unlocked, and you need to actually have offensive consumable items. The game does give you a variety of items and garment grids to give a character access to other abilities and effects. Too bad Alchemists also have just awful stats for, well, any damage. Their strength is mediocre at best, their magic stat is actively awful. So, having poor damage and needing to desperately keep the party alive was a complicated problem. For, what, like an hour? Then I unlocked Mega Potion on the Stash ability, which gave me access to a free, all-target, 2000 HP heal. And then the game stopped being difficult in any way. I mean, I still died a few times, but that was only because I was comically underleveled from all the content I was skipping. Part of this was that I was trying to be mindful of the amount of time I was spending on recording, but it was mostly that completing those sections wouldn't have given me anything that useful. I had a 100% walkthrough open in front of me, and at each segment I just looked at what items I'd get in the next area. And the vast majority of these items were either completely worthless, or so minor of an improvement it wasn't worth the time to get them. Alchemists just really don't have anything they need outside of their class. Other than Mug, I guess, which was a bit useful, though honestly it was a lot less impactful than I'd hoped when I'd unlocked it. The game did bring the pain a bit in the final sequence of fights, but it's hard to say how much of that was actual difficulty and how much of that is just that I was underleveled. Even then, I really only died because I was so checked out I missed that my defensive boost had been dispelled. Which was just a silly mistake when I had the materials to cast Wall on the entire party like 40 times. Seriously, it's so easy to get Lunar Curtains in this game, and combining one with a potion is stupidly busted. Especially on a class that is already busted. It's been over a decade since I've played this game casually. Is it always this easy? And the final game on the list is Final Fantasy XII, which gets to be placed in the second to last difficulty. Because while it was considerably more difficult than 10-2, it was still not nearly as challenging as 5 or 3, which frankly is the most surprising result in this entire ranking. I've played all the games I've put on this channel many times, other than the Tuesday afternoon game night games obviously, and I usually go into a series with a pretty good idea of how the results are going to shake out. I went into this series a bit less informed than usual, because I tend to avoid consumables, and therefore consumable expert classes, but I legitimately expected Machinist to be a nightmare. I even considered that it might actually be one of the hardest monoclass runs in FF12. And I could not have been more wrong. I've been very dismissive of Machinist over the years. Why use consumables when healing magic is free? Why use guns when other weapons deal more damage? What does Machinist have that is actually useful? And I stand by these statements in a casual run. If you aren't class-restricted, Machinist will always fall behind other classes. However, in a monoclass run, Machinist's mediocre everything is actually a huge boon. Guns aren't the best weapon in the game, but it's way better than crossbows, staves, or a single dagger. And while consumables cost money and aren't as good as Curaga or Curaja, it's definitely better than just Cure, no matter how many magic lores you have. And while not unique to Machinist, the potion lores and remedy lores are huge for dealing with single target healing and the status effects that can actually be difficult to deal with when you are used to using Curaga and Desuna. So I can think of a better class for every single use case than Machinist, but I'm not actually sure there is a single class that is better than Machinist at everything. So in a casual run, Machinist is very mid, but in this run it was delightfully mid. And this meant I could go through most of the game pretty smoothly. I think the closest to an actual challenge I ran into was the limited number of consumables you can carry at once. And that was really only relevant for Giruvegan and the Pharaohs, and even then only because I'm lazy and I didn't want to leave, buy more items, and come back. Okay, difficulty is concluded and we rush headlong into the recommended section. And our first game, FF3, gets to slide into second to last place. Huzzah! Celebrate! FF3 managed to score not last for the first and maybe only time. This is a big step up for FF3. Applause. Jokes aside though, I actually wanted to put this game higher on the list, mostly as a reward for being not a miserable experience. Second to last in recommended may not sound like a compliment, but considering prior runs of FF3 have been sat so firmly in last place they have squatters' rights, this is a huge improvement. So while I can't place it higher because the top two games are just better experiences, I wanted to highlight that success, and it really has a lot going for it. First was that my expectations were as low as they've ever been. Prior runs of FF3 inspired no confidence, and Scholar's normal role as a niche and forgettable nothing class did not help matters. But then I got into the run. Then I saw the damage numbers, and while they were fleeting, because I only have so many consumables, they were exciting. Scholar is strong, like really genuinely strong, which is not what I expected. Part of that is just that only leveling one class means your job level is naturally going to get quite high, and because that impacts damage formulas, and the alchemy bonus, in the Pixel Remaster version, leveling only one class is always going to be stronger than you'd expect. On the other hand, Red Mage crumpled like wet tissue paper in the latter half of the game, and even Devout ended up being so weak I was leveling up in the World of Darkness in the hopes of making the boss fights less tedious. But Scholar was anything but tedious. Because consumables are a limited resource, whether you can buy them or not, the Scholar run became a game-long puzzle. Do I use a consumable here? Will I need it more later against a stronger boss? And thanks to Scholar's sheer power, even the weakest offensive items were still impactful in the final battle. I was disappointed my first real attempt at the final sequence fell short, barely failing to beat Cloud of Darkness, but I was having fun. Real, actual fun in the final boss gauntlet of Final Fantasy III. I mean, each boss was a little bit dull, and frankly they still have too much HP, but I was always engaged considering what resources I needed to expend, what resources were most valuable. So FF3 gets to be slotted into third place, but don't let the comparatively low placement scare you off. If you are looking to replay FF3 and want a fresh approach, go for it. This was really fun. Although, maybe consider relenting a little bit and making your fourth character a thief to steal consumables. It should be way faster than waiting for drops. And next up is FF5. I always kind of knew that Chemist would be fun and interesting, but I generally avoid it, mostly because I avoid consumables. And of course, my last attempt of FF5 was my abandoned White Mage only playthrough, so I was very curious to see what Chemist would bring to the table. And I was not disappointed, with FF5 earning the coveted top spot. Chemists are just so fun in this game. In a way, they hit very similar beats to Blue Mages. They are a weird mixture of odd effects that no other class can copy. Hey, would you like double HP? Would you like to increase your character's level for higher damage mid-combat? And yeah, they suffer a bit in the early game by not having access to some of the really interesting mixture materials, but that is a puzzle in its own way. Once the run really gets underway, right when you reach World 2, it really goes hard. Between drink and mix, Chemists may have the widest variety of effects in the entire game. And while the limited equipment, basically just daggers, would be a hindrance for any other class, the sheer buffing power chemists have is just unstoppable. Oh, I'm underleveled? No, actually, I'm not. Oh, I don't have enough HP? That's not true. Oh, you reduced my entire team to 1 HP? Too bad I have the best healing of any class in the game. It's truly ridiculous, and unlike a later entry I'll get into, all that power and versatility doesn't become boring, because you don't have one solution to every problem, you have a plethora of solutions, and you need to decide which one is the most impactful. There are almost certainly strategies to the bosses in this game that I never even considered. I mean, I completely missed Blessed Kiss until the X-Death fight. What other nonsense can be pulled off with all the options Chemist has? And that sort of fun replayability easily scores the top slot in recommendation, which is such a nice palate cleanser for FF5. Oh, hi Tentu. Yes, you get to be in last place. No, it wasn't close. I'm so sorry. Yeah, Alchemist really suffers by committing the most fundamental crime any run can commit. It was boring. Specifically this run, obviously. The game itself is quite good, at least I remember it being good. The problem is just that alchemists are shockingly lacking in versatility. You'd think that mix and item boosting moves would mean the same versatility as FF5, and you'd be wrong. The most useful mix was Wall on the entire party, which is both very strong and should be used in every meaningful encounter, which makes it boring. Alchemists also have really bad stats in all the ways that could otherwise be leveraged for interesting options. Oh, I could get Freiraga on an alchemist. Neat. Hope you enjoy spending MP for trash damage because your magic stat is actual garbage. But the real criminal here is, of course, the stash command. Having Mega Potions for free at any time was just a bad design decision. And it basically means if an enemy can't kill a character in one hit, then they can't kill her at all. Oh, you inflict statuses? Good thing I have remedies on tap. In prior games, I had functionally infinite healing with the damage I was dealing and the amount I could heal. This is the only game where I had literally infinite healing. And Mega Potion can be unlocked incredibly early in the game, even if you don't cheat the Alchemist in at the very start. And all that defensive power combined with no real offense meant the fights were so boring. They took a while because my damage was bad, but there was no real strategy to work with because Mega Potions invalidate every problem I could run into. It just ends up so disappointing. I talked at the start of the video how I cheated in infinite copies of the Alchemist Dress Sphere so I could take advantage of the gates in garment grids for their unlockables, and then I didn't really use that option very much, and in retrospect, I wish I'd used it more. Not because I needed to make the game easier, but because I wanted to make the game faster. And that brings me to FF12, which gets to slide into second place. And to be fair, it was pretty close between this and FF5. FF12 earned a high spot because, well, partly just because FF12 is a really good game, easily my favorite of the 4 in this series, but 12 Machinist Only also has earned a high spot by just being really interesting to play. Particularly for me, where a lot of the considerations were very counter to how I would normally play a Final Fantasy. Consumable use? Don't know her. But that was my only option. And it was also very much helped by what I learned trying to make my white mage damage passable. Except with guns, the bonus from Berserk, Haste, and Bravery make damage that is not passable. It's actually quite strong. And I'm very excited to see what those combos will do for me when I have even better weapons. But, despite all the high praise I heaped on this run, and could continue to heap on this run, it does fall just a bit shy of FF5's greatness. And the short version is that it's a bit less interesting to actually play. Don't get me wrong, a lot of strategizing and considering went into my gambits, what accessories I would need, how to keep my party healed, but then the fight starts and the decisions have kind of all been made. The fight basically just happens, which is typical of FF12, but when compared to all the choices and decisions I had to make every single round in FF5, it does come up a bit short. Every action in FF5 was calculated and considered. I mean, it wasn't, but it could have been. Whereas FF12 is a bit more streamlined and losing some interest. And one big issue with this run were measures. Very interesting idea, very strong in this run, actually tedious in process though, because you can't program a gambit for that. You have to manually turn off the attack gambit, lest you buff an endgame boss by mistake, then equip the measure, then attack an ally, hope the 70% status procs, then switch back to an actual weapon and re-enable the attack gambit. This is tedious in several ways. It also meant opening menus so many times in recording that I actually shouted at myself about opening the menu while editing that video. So, despite a lot of good, it fails to earn the top slot. And that is it! The item specialist runs are done, the summary video is concluded, and that was a lot of fun. Despite some rough patches, despite some headaches, I'm really happy with this series. It was a late addition to my potential series list, and it definitely was a good inclusion. But that is the end of the series. I did want to shout out that I do have a Patreon, linked in the description. I spend a lot of time making these videos, so if you enjoyed the video, want to support the channel, and are financially stable enough to do so, that exists. No pressure though, this channel is free to enjoy for everyone, and will remain that way. For now, if you'd like this video, be sure to hit the like button. If you'd like to see more of this, feel free to subscribe. Hey, maybe leave a comment if you have something you'd like to say. But whatever you decide to do, have a safe trip home.